Shack is a little old place where we can get together. Love Shack, baby. Love Shack, baby, Love Shack. Are we live? Dommy, why is it always you? We're always waiting on you. Oh, hey, guys. What's going on? It's Throw It Out There Thursday. Tech Thursday, I'm sorry. We're going to be talking about the new Can-Am. And I want to apologize to everyone. We were late because Premature John made us late. But in order to talk about this new Can-Am, we got to go over to Justin Smith.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. So I don't know, it's a kind of a fitting segue into our show today about suspension, how Steve's singing the Love Shack, because you could probably get there a lot faster if you're in the new Maverick R, which is our subject. We're kind of known for our whiteboards and a little bit of technicality side. Maybe I go a little too techie, but some people like it, like me, nobody else. But we are going to touch upon what everyone is wound up about, which is the front end geometry on the new Maverick R. So in order to do that, we do want to have your questions. So make sure that you send them. That way Mitch and Dom can let us know what you're doing. And if it has to do with what we're talking about, we'll break in and do it, answer your question right away. If it's a different subject, we'll get to it at the end. But to go into the front end on this new vehicle, the obvious is very apparent. We're looking at a completely radically different visual on this front end geometry than anything in the past. Some people have an issue with the visual on it. I don't, and the reason is that I'm more concerned about function typically with anything that we do. We want something to work the best first, and we'll get around to the other stuff later, like most fabricators. But to kind of go into what this does well, we'll go into some of the definitions and things that are in geometry and what everyone's been chattering about with roll center and other things. So we'll start with that. Steve or Mitch, you guys got anything to go into before I dive onto the whiteboard?
Not yet.
Not yet? All right.
Not yet.
Very cool. So believe it or not, we've stepped up the production a little bit. We got a TV with some real pictures this time, which normally it's going to be stick figures only by me. So
Boom.
Thank you very much for doing that. We've got a visual of the front end on the Maverick R. And as you can see, everything we're talking about with a larger spindle design, higher mounted upper arm, and ball joint over the center of the tire. These are the obvious things that everybody has seen and wants to know why you would do that. Well, I'll get to the whys here in 1 second. First, let's go over some of the terminology and geometry that everybody's been talking about. So, roll center and how that is affected and connected to what Can-Am is calling force-based roll center. They are kind of one and the same, but a little bit different. First, roll center. What that is a fancy term for telling you about where that vehicle, when you enter a corner, is going to try and pivot on as it rolls in, and how all the forces in the front end are going to be applied to get to that point. It's pretty straightforward if you're a guy like me that's done this quite a bit, but if you want to find out where that is, you draw an imaginary line through the upper arm out into space. Draw an imaginary line through the lower arm out into space, and that'll give you 1 point there. And then you draw from that point to the contact patch of the opposite side. And for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that this suspension design is not offset for turning because you can change arm positions and offset your center line. But let's say the middle of the vehicle is our happy place. This is your roll center. Boom. Everything in this whole front end and vehicle as you enter a corner is going to pivot around that point. The lower that is, the flatter the vehicle is going to be in a corner. The lower that is, the less anti-sway bar you need to combat body roll. The lower that is, the better your vehicle is going to handle. Now, this is absolutely true for anything on asphalt when you've got ultimate traction when you enter a corner. Also, anything on asphalt that has a suspension system where the lower control arm is flat and level or compressed from that point. It's not exactly important or as important when the suspension droops out and or you're on dirt and you have less traction. It is something that can be considered and should be considered, but it's not the end-all be-all. One thing that might actually be more important than that is Can-Am's term of force-based roll center. Force-based roll center is what we're taking a look at on this picture right here. This is the direction that a lot of the forces starting at the tire are directed through the chassis. So if you, for instance, in this picture, the vehicle is making a right-hand turn, the outside tire is taking load from the outside of the corner. It could be the berm, it could just be the traction of the dirt. Either way, but the load that's going through the bottom of this tire is also transferred through the ball joints and the spindle through the lower control arm at the angle of the lower control arm when you attack this. So if it's drooped out, then that is going to have an upward push. If it's compressed, it's going to have a level or downward push into the bottom of the chassis. The converse is the case, or opposite, at the top of the spindle or upper control arm. As you see a load inward on the bottom of the tire and inward on the bottom control arm, you're going to see the opposite on the upper. This upper arm technically is going to pull the chassis outward, which causes some more body roll. That is force-based roll center. Now, force-based might be, and this is just my opinion, the more important of either of these two at this time, because we do not have an angled arm system in the new Can-Am. It is a parallel arm system. So it's harder to figure your roll center on this kind of a deal. It's a lot easier to figure the load that's pulling on the chassis this way and pushing on it this way that would create some body roll. So as you take the older, John, if you can go to the stock front suspension on the earlier X3, which is also on this vehicle over here if you take a look on the right. It's one of the race cars in the team. But you can see the shorter spindle or the older spindle design on the early X3s and compared to the newer spindle design on the new one. Over here on the TV, we've got that picture up now. This older design is going to have a lot more load pushing on this upper control arm when you enter a corner. It's going to have a lot more force on the chassis to try and lean it over. As much as 80% difference in force on the upper control arm compared to the split or taller spindle design where the upper control arm is mounted higher. So if you think about the last picture where load is pushing on the inside of this tire, pushing inward on the bottom control arm and pulling out on the upper, if this upper has, say, let's just use some round numbers. If you got 500 pounds of force coming in on the tire, we see 500 pounds going through the lower control arm, we might only see 100 pounds pulling the top of the chassis outward with this system versus 500 and maybe 350 on the upper arm. So these differences in loads and differences in an amount of force at the top of the chassis, think about it. You come in the top, you've only got 100 pounds pulling out on the top. That's a whole lot better than 350 or 400 pounds on the old system. So you need less sway bar. You need a little less spring to try and stop some of the body roll that might have been in the previous model compared to the new one. So when it comes to roll center, force-based roll, all of those things are much better with this longer spindle, taller spindle design, and higher mounted control arm pivot points. And that comes down to handling. We haven't driven one of these yet, or at least we haven't driven it hard enough yet. John actually has a trip planned coming up the end of this next week or middle next week. You've got a drive for this. I'm scheduled to get in one of these on the 8th for a full day of testing. So we'll be able to give you some input and opinions as to how that all works once we've driven the car. And I think it's going to be pretty awesome. I mean, just looking at the changes, I can definitely tell you that the improvements are going to be major when you start to feel that in the steering wheel. So any questions on that before I go to the next thing? John or Mitch or anybody?
There's one here. Is that energy and force redistributed to other areas of the car?
Well, it is, but it's only going to be distributed through the chassis according to the tube structure in the chassis. So if you're seeing load on the upper arm, well, how is that supported and how is that pushed through the rest of the chassis? That's basically it. Now, the new chassis is stiffer, more rigid design. So I think you're going to see that the car feels way more responsive and quick to enter as you turn in. versus before where you might have a lot of flex, which means you turn in, it takes a set, the front does its thing, the back does its thing, and then it finally comes around. Has a lot to do with chassis flex and lack of rigidity. So it should be better. John.
Well, and with this system, you don't need as strong of a chassis up front because you're spreading the load out.
Really good point. So usually when you've got a lot of load on the chassis and you start breaking parts, then they're going to add tubing, add material, add gussets, and add weight. And that's not a good thing all the way around. We don't want to add that to these things. So if you can lower the loads that the suspension is throwing to the chassis, you can run a lighter frame. Or you can structure it differently. For instance, upper arms mounted higher. Well, there's already a shock mount up high in this chassis. It's already supported and structured in that section. Well, that means you have to add less support to hold the arms if you're already attaching to a strong shock mount area. So you kind of concentrate all of your structure into one spot, mount everything to it, you end up with a lighter, complete overall frame. So it's good all the way around. Next, kingpin inclination angle. Well, kingpin inclination angle is, if you were to draw an imaginary line through the upper ball joint and through the lower ball joint, if I can get this one going, that imaginary line is kingpin angle. And you can see that there's a very, very big difference, and I think we actually have on here, John, if you can flip through that to the imaginary line picture, we'll get to it. Kingpin inclination is, it does a lot. Typically, the more angle that you throw at this and lean this out, some off-road angles in spindle design can range from 4 degrees to 9 degrees of inclination angle. The farther that you lean that over, or the more angle you throw at it, what happens is, as you turn in, the tires don't turn flat. The tires roll up and down on the right inner and up and down on the outer, so you end up with a contact patch that comes to the back of the tire. Well, imagine this, as it turns and leans, now the vehicle gets traction in a corner, the outside one becomes flat. The inside one, as it droops out, is actually flatter contact patch when you do that. Another thing that gives you is steering wheel feel. So as you turn in and you feel like, oh, I can feel a little more load the farther I turn, the heavier the wheel gets. What that is the tire standing up and the dirt going underneath it trying to push it back straight. That's what you're feeling in the wheel. So a little bit of kingpin angle is important for road feel, because as you're driving along and you're just counter steering because the thing's loose in the dirt, and I like my driving right here, but as it's loose in the dirt, how do you know that you're super sideways? Either your brain is telling you you're going that way and the car's facing this way, or your butt cheeks and your steering, you can feel the load in the wheel and you're like, oh yeah, I can counter into that. That is all calculated up here due to feel in the wheel and the rest of the car. So a little bit of road feel is a great thing and kind of necessary, especially in the dirt. But too much is just that. Too much of a good thing can become a bad thing pretty quick. Kingpin angle is a very important thing. If you take a look at the change with the taller spindle design, ball joint more centered across the tire, you can see that the kingpin angle of the new design is much less than what I've drawn on the board, and I'm exaggerating over here. But the advantages that gives is you're going to have less load into the steering system, which previous models had a lot of steering load in them. So much so that rack and pinions could have failures because of the amount of load when the aftermarket and basically us are throwing 35s on a vehicle and overloading the whole system. Then you're going to find the next weak points. Well, those are taken care of and fixed with this design, because you're going to drop the loads through all the tie rods, you're going to drop loads through the steering system, you're going to drop loads on the power steering unit. All of those things get a better, an easier time when you're driving this stuff with the kingpin angle like that. Now, how much does this affect the road feel that I was talking about? How much does it affect your drivability and the way that you can enter a corner and feel what the car is doing? I don't know. I'll know on the 8th once we drive it. I do know this, everyone that I've talked to in the racing industry that's already been in these things loves it. So it's probably the right amount, judging by their reaction. We'll see. I can tell you a little bit more later. Got anything, Mitch or Steve?
There's one more question about the force with the shock. It said, with the shock being mounted to the bottom arm, does that change the force on the upper ball joint also?
It does. You're going to have, so wherever the shock is mounted is going to see the most force. Whenever you hit something, it's going to go directly into that shock path. So if on this one, as you hit something in this spindle, the ball joint that's going to take the most load is going to be the upper connected to the shock, because that's where your force against it is coming from, right there. Mounting this on the lower arm means that the bottom ball joint's going to see more load. Personally, I'll tell you that I think the shock mounted to the lower arm is the best thing you could possibly do in off-road for multiple reasons. One, the lower arm hits rocks, typically. So the lower arm has to have strength to not fold when you hit something, right? Well, if you built the lower arm up super strong so it doesn't fold when you hit something, but you have the shock on the upper arm, you also have to have a super strong upper arm to support the loads that the shock puts on it. Now you got two strong arms and adding a pile of weight. If you mount the shock to the lower arm that already has to be strong for rocks, you still have a strong lower arm for the shock too. The upper arm can now get super light, and you're not going to lose anything by doing that. So I feel that the lower arm mount is better. Also, when you mount the shock to the lower arm, you have the ability to lower that shock mount down. Imagine if that shock was mounted to this arm and it would be above your head, right? So that's not even a visually possible thing to do. But look at the old one. This shock mount is at the hood height, which is pretty much the limiting factor to your vision. What if this shock was mounted to the lower arm? We could lower that down also below the hood, and you could lower the hood itself, and you would have more vision for rock crawling and other things like that. So mounting it to the lower arm has a ton of advantages. You could build a lighter weight vehicle by doing that because you don't have to have a strong upper. You've got vision advantages. You can take the shock and lean it out, get more motion ratio benefits by doing that. There's a ton. So I prefer lower arm. Thanks, Mitch. Back to, where was I again? Kingpin. So we talked about that. We talked about how the change in that can be very advantageous to loads. We'll drive it and see what the feel is, but from what we hear, it's pretty damn good. Scrub radius. Scrub radius is usually a very bad thing if you have too much of it. Scrub radius is the distance between the center of the tire at the contact patch of the ground and where the kingpin inclination angle passes that point as well. Scrub radius typically should be less than an inch. In this 1 inch to half an inch range, you get a good amount of feel in the wheel that we talked about before. It tells you the direction that you're driving. You can feel a little bit as you hit stuff. If the bump that you hit is straight, you can feel that in the wheel with scrub radius being accurate. Or if the bump is crooked, you can feel it in the wheel to duke left to right. You can kind of feel what the road is doing with scrub. But if you have too much, for instance, if you took this wheel offset and you put the wrong wheel offset on it, oops, dropping my marker. You kick this whole thing out, and now your scrub radius is, say, I don't know, 3 inches. Too much scrub is a horrible thing on steering, on rack and pinions, on tie rods, on steering wheel feedback. Here's why. Imagine this whole spindle right here is pivoting on these two joints, right? So as you hit something, this whole system wants to crawl over the bump vertically. But it also wants to hit it and turn it. If your scrub radius is accurate, then you only have, say, half an inch to an inch of load trying to turn this. But if your scrub is wrong with the wrong wheel offset or spindle design, and you got 3 inches of scrub, that means whatever you're hitting now has 3 inches of leverage to try and turn this. That leverage just instantly tries to rip the wheel out of your hand when you hit bumps. It tries to destroy the tie rod. It tries to destroy the steering rack and pinion. It destroys power steering units. Everything in the steering assembly just takes a massive hit and the drivability of the vehicle is tough. It also tries to wander and you can't hold it straight. So scrub radius is super important. Looking at what Can-Am has done, it looks like that was exactly what they had in mind when they picked the inclination angle here, when they picked the wheel offset, overall spindle design. They're very, very concerned about that scrub, and they should be. And to me, that means that this is going to have very little kickback. It's going to have very little steering wheel feedback that wants to rip it out of your hands, and that's super common in off-road, especially when you start changing some stuff. I'm really happy to see that they've spent some time on that because it's a major thing.
And that the wheel they have is one of the, as far as I understand, is one of the highest positive offsets ever in a UTV.
Thanks for pointing that out. A lot of people ask us why everybody does that with a flat on the outside, most of the wheel facing inward, right? Well, take a look at this as well. The goal with all of that is to place the bearing of the hub and spindle centered on the tire contact patch. So imagine if this wheel wasn't completely buried in here with that offset. Maybe it was a center offset like this. Now all the load would be pushed out 3 or 4 inches past the center line of the bearing, and bearings fail fast. It's all about leverage. You start throwing things farther out there. Imagine all the load on that bearing if you put a 10-foot adapter and a tire on there. It's just going to want to snap the bearing off. It's going to want to wear things out fast. It's going to put a lot more load on the spindle. It's going to put more load on the upper and lower arms. Everything sees more load if you don't have the contact patch of the tire lined up with everything supporting it from a bearing and a spindle and ball joint standpoint. So hopefully that answers your question on that.
Yeah, and that applies to all UTVs, and when people put spacers on their cars or they buy a offset wheel, it jacks up your steering and wears out all the bearings and everything too.
It absolutely does. Bearings, hubs, upper lower ball joints, steering, all of them take a heavy hit, all of them get more load, all of them wear out faster when you change all of those things. And you're adding scrub radius, back to that important scrub radius number. As soon as you run the wheel offset wider, as soon as you put a wheel spacer on there, you jack up the scrub radius. Now every bump you hit has more leverage against the steering and your steering wheel. Now you wonder, all of a sudden you put wheel adapters on there and the steering wheel wants to rip out of your hand. Well, that's why. You just added leverage to everything in the front end, and you definitely don't want to do that. All right, so wheels, scrub, bump steer. Bump steer is the difference in toe set. So for instance, if you're at ride height, you always want to set the toe of your front end. Different vehicles like different things, but typically it's toed in and toed in just a little bit, like 1/4 inch toed in, something like that. And street vehicles are going to measure that in degrees, like 1 degree or whatever it might be. But typically you've got a toe set. Let's just say for argument's sake that it's 0. They're both facing perfectly straight and parallel. 0 toe. Bump steer is, as the suspension cycles through its travel, droop, ride height, and compression, the change in toe. So if it's 0 at ride height and maybe it droops out and toes in, that's bump steer. How much of that? Maybe measure that. It could be 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches of change. Then you have 2, 3, or 4 inches of bump. Compression could toe in as well. It could toe out. You can have out compressed. You can have in drooped. You can have the opposite, out, drooped out, and toed in, compressed. Whenever you have toe change, that makes for a vehicle that wants to follow every groove in the road or choose the direction it wants to go down a straight road as you're going through bumps, because the tires are doing this as they're going up and down over a whoop. How could you possibly drive something straight? Every time you go through a whoop, it does this. It wants to choose which direction it wants to go. You just can't do it. So bump steer is super important. Also, too much bump ruins steering components. Back to all of this coming together and all of this new design that's right here. It is designed to have the least amount of load transferred to every part of this suspension and every part of the chassis. There's very little load on this ball joint right here. I doubt anyone could ever break that upper. They might have to break the lower to get this to snap off and break that. I doubt the upper is ever going to have a failure with this design. You're not going to have any failure in arm mounts. You're not going to have any failure on pivot points. when the loads are dropped as much as they've done this with this design. You're not going to have steering components wear out when you've got scrub controlled as much as they have here. All of these things are really, really thought out, done well, and are going to last much longer than any previous UTV designs have in the past. Talked about bump, talked about loads getting cut down, camber curve. On this design, since we know that it's a parallel arm design, we know, and we don't have a vehicle here to give you measurements, so I don't know how much this is. We'll be able to tell you when we've got one, but until then, we're guessing. Lower arm length compared to upper arm length, it looks like they're very similar in length. If anything, the upper is slightly shorter. So what that means is, as this suspension cycles, you're not going to see a ton of negative camber or positive camber change throughout cycle. And that stability you can pretty much feel in the car as consistency. You come into a corner a little drooped out, it's going to act the same as it comes in at ride height or compressed, because the tire isn't going to have major changes. So that consistency and feel makes for confident drivers, makes for faster race car guys and race cars. So I think that all is a positive thing too. Hub loads, we kind of talked about that a little bit with an offset wheel and a center design bearing within this package. Loads on the hub, loads on this spindle are also going to be a lot less. Longer lasting, less breakage, and all in all, super positive on all that stuff. You guys have any questions I can answer before we go to some other stuff?
You're answering a lot of them as you're talking, which is good.
As if I was reading the list you're looking at?
Pretty much.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, keep going. We'll
So
wait for some more to come in.
let's address what everybody's talking about on the internet. People like or don't like the visual of this. I, again, am more about function. And the amount of loads that have been dropped with this design, I think, far outweigh anybody's negative. It's personal opinion, whether you like it or not. You know, you like pink, you like blue, that's your choice. You like tall spindle, low spindle, it's just a visual thing. But I think performance-wise, it's awesome. And everybody should be giving that some consideration. Other things that I think on the new vehicle, and maybe, John, you can flip through some of the pictures, but I think that people are not giving any credit to, that I'll step away from the suspension design right now, and they should be giving a ton of credit to. You're talking about a UTV with 240 horsepower. That's 15-ish, doing my math right, 15 more than the Pro R, which was 20 more than the previous highest horsepower. So within literally 24 months, or 12 months-ish, we've got a UTV with 40 more horsepower than everything else had. So that is amazing. People need to be giving that some credit. Also, within the engine design and new turbo design, you've got anti-lag built into the system with dropping cylinders and increasing airflow so that the turbo is actually running at a higher speed, even at an idle. So when you crack the throttle, you've got boost instantly. I mean, that's technology that you only see in rally racing in Europe. And you're talking about stuff that's making 600 horsepower out of a Subaru and never having a boost issue when they're on and off the throttle. That type of mentality is in this and super awesome. I think they should be getting a lot more credit. Also, transmission. You're looking at a 7-speed, seamless shift, dual clutch. You can shift, I mean, there's no belt. I mean, you can pretty much drop the mic, right? That cures so much that everybody's always bitched about. I think that they should be getting credit for all of that. Also being able to shift from high to low on the fly and back and forth, you're going to make everyone at KOH super happy being able to do that instead of having to stop and shift up or down. So a lot is really coming in this vehicle that people need to think about. Also, shock design. In previous models, you've got smart shocks that you could choose from. With a smart shock system, you had one live valve, which is basically a piston on the piston, or basically in the center or above the piston is the controlling item, electronic control, to take sensor input from the vehicle and translate that through algorithms to change compression and rebound throughout the stroke and cycle. Smart shock. Well, this is basically Smart Shock 2.0, if not 3.0, because you've got the standard internal control, and you also have the external one that's been added, or the live valve on the outside of the shock. Having two, why would you need two? Well, now everything can be changed for the better, because this external valve right here is controlling all compression functions, and the internal one can control rebound. Having the control over both, we have seen the advantages of this already in a Pro R suspension. Amazing ride quality, super tunable. Now, those advantages are translated into the Can-Am, and I think you're gonna see really big improvements on how you can change it, how you can tune it, how you can drive it, and the control and safety of going kind of to the edge, driving over that a little bit, and knowing that you can do it, it'll take it. So really excited about that, big advantages there. John, I think you had a couple other things you wanted me to touch on too that I didn't have memorized, but.
Big brakes.
Oh, I love me some brakes. Because
3-piston up front now?
yeah, 3-piston front, 2-piston rear. I mean, that is incredible, because throw all the horsepower you want at it. If you can't stop it, then you still wreck the car, right? So you have to be able to stop it. And within the racing that we do and all the guys that we support and sponsor, brakes are more important than the horsepower. So glad to see all of that for sure. Any other questions on suspension? Or can I put that away, Mitch?
Ryan wants to know, why is there no more remote reservoirs, and will that cause quicker shock fade?
So I don't know what the reason was why the change was made, but I will tell you this. I am a fan of a connected resi or a piggyback resi compared to a remote. Now, I know the marketing, and for years has said and told us that a remote reservoir is better because you've got it up in the air, you can possibly get better cooling by doing that, all kinds of reasons. But the truth is, something that maybe nobody's heard of, but I'll tell you, the hose on a remote reservoir typically is 20 inches long, 18 to 26 inches, something in that range. The hose itself, imagine it as being about the diameter of the shaft of the shock. Well, when you hit a bump and you compress the shock, the amount of oil that leaves the shock body and goes into the reservoir is equal to the diameter length of the shaft that comes into that body. Well, think about it. That's a 7/8 shaft that might be 14 inches long. That's not that much oil. So the oil that leaves the head of the shock and travels down that reservoir, remote resi hose, never really even gets to the reservoir if you've got a 2-foot long hose and you're only displacing 14 inches of shaft on the inside. So the oil goes halfway down the hose and comes back, halfway down the hose and comes back. It takes forever for that oil to actually get to the reservoir where it might be in the air and might actually cool down. And even when it gets to the resi, it's really hard to mix. And so for that reason, you see developments like the ECS2 external cooler from Fox, which has a one-way system where oil passes down one hose, goes through the reservoir, and comes down a whole nother hose. So it doesn't just go back and forth in the same hose. It literally does cycle and actually cools. So I'm more of a fan, if you're not doing a circulatory system, of a piggyback reservoir, because the oil definitely leaves the shock, goes in the reservoir, mixes, and comes back. Unless it's sitting next to the exhaust pipe, it's probably going to cool and mix a lot better. So, long-winded answer to your short question. I apologize. Doesn't bother me one bit. I like piggyback reservoirs.
There's a lot of people saying that you're costing them $55,000 right now.
Okay, sorry, not sorry. I'm just not. I think the car is awesome. I love the directions that they've gone with it. The engineers definitely put their heads down for multiple years and came up with some crazy stuff that's badass. And everybody should embrace it as much as they can. Steve?
Do you like the 6-lug wheel pattern?
Love it. More lugs, more better. That's trophy truck. 6-lug pattern. Now, it's not 1.25 inch stud, but hey, we can't all be that big when the stud department, right, Steve?
I know exactly.
Okay, cool.
I resemble that.
With Steve, people are asking about the lug nuts. There is none. What are your thoughts?
So I think that was a mistake. Looking at all the marketing, I believe Can-Am actually came out and cured that question. They didn't have studs on the display stuff that you're looking at, but I believe they said that it is studded. I know on this one it doesn't, but I thought that they said they run studs in production and not a lug stud.
I think
Am
it's
I wrong?
actually a threaded bolt.
Okay, so they're using a lug stud then?
Yes.
All
Yes,
right.
that's the way I understand it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. I don't think that I have a problem with it. A stud is threaded into the hub too. I know that the stud would pull differently on it than a torqued unit, but we're not talking about the deck on a head on a cylinder block and worried about how the deck's distorted here. It's not really an issue. So I don't have anything to offer there, but it doesn't seem to bother me much. What else you got?
Justin, if you can, please rate tube sock on 1 to 10 on the stud meter.
So I'm going to say that early in the morning, Steve is a 10 on the stud meter. You know why? Because we do have a secret handshake right there. Studley in the morning. Midday, gets a little grumpy. I'm going to have to drop stud meter down. No, I wouldn't say angry, no. You're hangry. Yeah, I would go, when he's hangry, he's, I don't know, more like a 4 or a 5, somewhere. He's kind of a little bitchy. But then at the end of the day, it's like end of the day, I'm going to go home, see the family. He's kind of back up to like a 9. But morning, he's a 10. You got that?
That's all that matters.
Right on.
Justin
Perfect,
says,
yes.
Logan in S3 says it's a wheel stud setup.
Wheel stud. See,
Wheel
that would be
stud.
different than what you said, John, right?
So it has studs.
So if it is a wheel stud, that's what I thought they had clarified, that it would be in production as a wheel stud. I don't know. Maybe hit up the Can-Am guys and see. We'll find out. I don't think I have a problem either way. Mitch, you good?
Just keep going.
Keep on going. All right. Any other questions on the board of stick figure-ness?
Well, when you drop down to strength down there,
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
one
So
of
here's
the-
some positives, right?
one of the really cool things is they've increased all the hardware to 14 millimeter on all the suspension.
Good point, man. Take a look at this picture. We point that stuff out. So we've got 14 millimeter hardware on all the shock components for sure, and I'm sure on most of the suspension points, looks like it from here. To jump up to 14 mil, that is just badass. I mean, basically, that's what we've been doing in our race programs for many years, taking all the 10 and 12 millimeter stuff out, drilling it out, and going standard at either 1/2 inch or 5/8 or 14 millimeter. So it's awesome to see that Can-Am is listening to their racers when it comes to these changes all the way around, because this is what we've done to keep hardware from having any failures and bending under the worst conditions when we're trying to break a car in a race. You know, and I'm glad to see that they've upgraded all of that. Really, really cool. Strength also, that spindle design, you know what, guys? This isn't brand new. This is not just invented today. This has existed on 2- and 4-wheel drive F-150s and other trucks for decades. And the reason is the same as I've been pointing out. Strength in the system, lower loads on the suspension points, and overall better for longevity. So taking that's existed for a long time and put in a UTV, that's definitely a first right here. But the benefits are badass. Strength in suspension, strength in chassis, isolating as much of this at the same point so you can use less tubing to keep it really, really strong. Concentrating at the shock mount, great idea. You know what? One thing I didn't bring up as we're getting to it, motion ratio. Do you have a shot of this straight from the front that we could get to? Maybe we see both sides. Or you know what? With the imaginary lines through the kingpin and arms, that would be a good one too. We could look at that. So motion ratio. You guys are wondering, well, why did they mount it to the lower arm? And why is there this big arm mount, triangular arm mount on this? Well, one thing that is always the same on off-road suspension design, if you could possibly do it, having the shock at full compression be 90 degrees to the shock mount is the best system you could run. So, shock, fully compressed. Let's say that's the angle. I'm a little off on this. But when that tire is all the way up on a hit and that arm is maxed out, the best to possibly do from a geometry standpoint is have 90 degrees arm mount to shock. When you do that, it's basically creating the best motion ratio you can get. Motion ratio is the calculations between tire travel, angle of arm, arm mount, shock mount, angle of the shock, how all that relates to travel per shaft movement. Simply put, if the tire moves 2 inches and the shock shaft moves 1 inch, it's 2 to 1. That means that it's going to feel fairly soft and plush because the suspension has a lot of leverage against the shock trying to stop it from moving. As the best you could do would be as that suspension compresses farther, maybe halfway through its travel, now every 1.5 inches that it moves gives you an inch on the shock. Well, that's less leverage on the shock, more shock leverage on the car, which means it's naturally getting stiffer. All the way to fully compressed, where you get 1 inch of tire movement and 1 inch of shaft, 1-to-1 ratio, that would give you the stiffest feeling and acting suspension. So the shock can give you the most resistance to slow you down from bottoming out. That is a geometric way of making a progressive feeling front suspension or rear suspension so that it naturally is just plush in the bottom where it's moving and stiffens up automatically on the way up. Internally in the shock, shock designs are always trying to do that with valving, with piston, with bypass, all kinds of stuff. It's all the same. They're trying to make it plush in the middle and stiff when it needs to be. You do that with geometry too. Looking at this, the line, the imaginary line that's affecting the shock is between the shock mount and the pivot. So watch this come fully compressed, right about there. To me, that is very close to 90. It may not be exact, but it's really, really close, which means this has a rising rate, like I had just described. Even though the shock's leaned over, and most people think that's bad, typically shock standing up on a lower arm gets you to 90 a little easier. But what they've done, leaning it over and adding that extra shock height mount on the lower arm, gets you to 90 with the shock leaned over. So it's a good thing all the way around. We got design in here that's well thought out, gonna give a great ride quality without you having to, honestly us having to do all kinds of tricks inside the shock to get it plush and stiff when you need it. This has already got a lot of it in it. So really, really cool, right Mitch? So strength, both chassis, spindle, hub, arm, lighter loads everywhere. Strength goes up. Body roll is lessened because of the design of a taller spindle, higher shock or arm mount, less leverage on it, trying to pull it over in a corner. You've got motion ratio I just discussed, which is suspension acting on the shock. But from a geometric design, it's already plush and stiff when you need it. And overall loads. Kind of already talked about that, but loads through the suspension into the pivot points, into the ball joints, all being dropped by having this. I saw a cool video that my buddy Dustin Jones did with a broomstick. You guys can find it on the internet. I won't redo it, but it's a pretty awesome way of describing visually how much less load is on the system when you extend the upper and lower ball joint like they have. So I'm a fan. Can't wait to drive it. Going to happen here pretty soon. Mitch?
Opinions on the rear knuckles, same pros?
Yeah, it really is. We can probably get to that here real quick, but the rear knuckle, exactly the same pros. Even though we don't have any active steering in the back, you do have toe control. So this is a toe link that we're all familiar with on the previous models. The loads on that are going to be lighter when you've got a longer spindle. The loads on the lower pivot points, upper, are all going to be less when you have a taller spindle design like that. Again, the force-based roll center is much better with this. You've got less load on an upper trying to push the chassis over in a turn. All of the same things are much better all the way around. Center bearing design within the hub offset or wheel offset in this. So I think we're going to see really good things out of this one. Also, rear sway bar on here. I like the fact that there's nothing in the way from a clearance standpoint. It's longer than the previous models, which means we can have a very adjustable bar in here with multiple holes. Also, it means on the sway bar link side of things, we can actually put what we've got coming out here real soon, which is called eSway, and that's a live shock in the link place that controls how much sway the car will actually have, and you can tune that. That's a new product that we're going to have out and available in the next few months. We'll tell you more about it when we get closer, but that's a teaser. I like the packaging so we can do that really cool stuff coming up. Mitch?
Single shear on the middle rod.
On which one?
The toe rod.
Yeah,
rod.
We saw that too. Not a fan, but one thing I will tell you is I do believe that's a ball joint or a tie rod, outer tie rod ball joint style, which is probably a tapered pin. A tapered pin probably isn't going to wear out as fast as the previous models that we have, some double shear kits and some TLS kit that we make to support that. But that'll be one of the first things that we've got out. As a matter of fact, we're already designing some of the stuff on the double shear for that. So, yep, I share your concerns, and we will have product for it very soon. Steve, right now I'm thinking you're like a 7, maybe an 8. You got nothing?
What would be your first upgrade for the car, Justin?
Oh, man. First upgrade, I'm probably going to have to go with our go-tos on every UTV. Probably a spring kit to account for the accessories you guys are going to throw at this thing. I saw a ton of the options that Can-Am has available for packaging in the rear and trunk, multiple trunk packs, 35s. Yep, John, thank you. And from the back row, I think that's wheel and tire, taller, stronger, more spring packet or a spring package to account for the accessories that are thrown at it. And then the rest of it, let's drive it before I even talk about what I think it might need, right? We don't know until we do it. Steve.
People have asked if you were to get a flat on the front, do you think it would cause more damage because of the arm?
Absolutely not. I know everyone's like, yeah, the whole tire comes apart and it wraps around the upper, we're going to break an arm. No way. Remember what we said, there's less load on that. I don't care if you hit it with a tire carcass and not. I've never seen an upper or lower arm get destroyed from a tire wrapping around it in the desert yet, and that's the old design. So I really don't think that's an issue. Probably just as important as the amount of, if you care about how many bugs or bushes you're going to hit with it. Who cares?
It's not an 18-wheeler.
Yeah, don't care. I don't think it's a problem.
Do you know if they double sheared the front end at all?
It is. So all the arm mounts in the front are double sheared. We were able to see some of the drawings on that. Really excited. That way you don't have any double shear kits to put on there. And I forget the name of their bushing design, John. I forget what it is, but whatever it is, I've heard from the guys that have driven it that it's extremely quiet. And that bushing design might have something to do with that. So I'm excited. Good all the way. Cool. I think we've covered it. If you guys don't have any other questions you want to throw at Steve, who is maybe he's a 7 right now while he's itching his neck, going down to a 6. Mitch.
Double bonded bushing.
There it is. Thank you. Double bonded bushing. Whatever the heck double bonded means, I have no clue. But if it makes it quieter, I'm all for that too. Love it. Rapid fire. Steve, you're first.
Why did they relocate the rear sway bar? Does it make a difference?
Yes. I don't know why they did it. That you have to ask the engineers, but I will tell you it makes it a whole lot easier for us to make cool sway bars. And it makes it a whole lot easier to make it super adjustable, which all of you are going to want no matter what. So I would say it's badass.
Sick
all the way
boy.
around. Yeah. Mitch, what?
Any word on the 4-seater?
No. Crickets.
Damn. Do you foresee any issues with changing the offset or with paddles?
I wouldn't change the offset much. I think you could probably, let's just assume, again, I don't have one in front of me. Let's assume that's a 6-1. Maybe it's a 5-1, I don't know. But if it's a 6-1, I wouldn't go and change that more than an inch. So a 6-1 would be a 5-2. I would not be putting 4.3s on these. No way. No. You're looking at way too many negatives. Scrub radius, steering, kickback, feedback, all going to go out the window. You don't want any of that. So what? It's already wide. It's 79 inches wide, right? Yeah, you don't need stability from a wheel spacer to fix that. It's already awesome. Paddle tire, yeah. I mean, if you're going to run a 35 with paddles, maybe it's a clearance problem in the back. I don't know. We haven't put one on. But I think, you know what I have heard, John, we were talking about earlier? Guys that want to take these in the mud and they want to put 44s or 50s on it, well, they can't put them on this, right? I don't think so. I think they can. And the reason that I think they can, John, can you go back to a front spindle on this? Is because you guys are all concerned about the tire hitting the top of the spindle on the front. Remember, in order to put a 44-inch tire on any current vehicle, everyone is using a portal offset. So it is wider to begin with, which kicks it out for clearance. It also drops it down. Let's say you do a small portal on this, would be a 4-inch portal. It's going to drop it down to about the height of a lower ball joint. Well, all you've done is given yourself another 4 inches of clearance up here. So if it clears a 35, you can clear a 39 to a 40 with a portal plus the offset, which means I think you're going to throw all the mud tires on that you want on this thing. I don't think there's going to be a problem.
It's going to be 86 inches wide.
Yeah, you're over 80 inches. Who cares? It's a mud hole. We don't have any trail restrictions on mud holes. I haven't seen any of those yet. Anybody complaining about the width on this, you're in an area that has a narrow trail requirement. This is not the car for you anyway. There's plenty of those. You can get Commanders and all kinds of capable stuff. So don't try and turn that into your trail car. It's not. It's a fast, haul-ass, fun toy with bitchin' geometry on the front. Can-Am, good job. Everybody, leave it alone. Give them credit for all the awesome things on this car. That's what I think you should do. Mitch, anything?
Are we going to do both billet and chromoly options on upcoming upgraded parts?
Yes, we will. Just as we have currently on radius rods, we're going to have both. And you guys asked me like a year ago when we'd have high clearance radius rods for stuff out of billet, and I said next month, a year ago.
Yeah.
Guess what? We finally made a set, and they're on a vehicle testing. So believe it or not, we might actually have them next month if you asked me that question today. Some more parts coming out, but I digress. We're not talking about that right now. We should stay on that. Steve, what do you got?
Yes, Justin. Someone wanted to know, how does it compare to the Speed UTV?
You know what? It absolutely...
It came out. Sorry, Robbie.
I haven't driven either one of them, can't tell you. End of that story. That's it. All right, you guys don't have anything worth a damn. Your questions are starting to really suck. Let's just get on. Dom, last one.
Track width with the suspension when it's fully cycled.
We don't have one, man. I don't know. I'm guessing it's going to narrow up quite a bit. Just by looking at what I can see from the pictures, I'm guessing we're probably going to have 4 or 5 inches of track width change. But we'll find out when we get one. Maybe we'll tell you. Maybe we'll cycle one for you in the video. Either way, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully, our explanation of some of this stuff helps. Hopefully, everybody that wants to talk smack on the internet, stop it. There's a lot of positive stuff here that they should be getting credit for. That's what I think. And until we do this again with a car in our hands, or after we drive it on the 8th for me, next week for John, we'll let you know more when we get that. For now, I think we turn this over to number 6 on the hot scale.
Oh,
Steve,
come on.
take us out of here.
All right, fine. If you're looking to buy anything from us, please visit www.shottherapyusa.com. Or if you're trying to book an appointment for Glamis or any other time, 623-217-4959. A 6?